Ping pong. Actually, it works. Hello. Uno, dos, tres. Waiting for. Hello. Yeah, okay. Works. As always, my name is Ramirez. Ogi-san. Um, my family likes to call me Gordo. Um, I'm a man of many names. I shouldn't say that because people will, think of the other guy. I was talking about people. I think I should just start with a conversation about how. So I was at the gym today, and I was talking to a buddy of mine named Richie, and so we just got to chatting, and I don't remember how he brought this up, but he brought up a book called *Sapiens*, and this is the book, *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*. At least in relation to what we were talking about, got more to show about this guy, Yuval. But before we go into that, he mentioned something interesting. Do not want to use that color right now. What color was I using? Oh, dark color. I guess we'll just slide this bar over here. So, back to people, right? Because this goes into my whole hijacking conversation piece, and sorry, I'm not very good at drawing the and symbol. Hijacking conversations. And thoughts. So, when he was bringing up this book, we were having or at least he was telling me about how what he found very interesting about this book, *Sapiens*, was the evolution pattern that he noticed, or at least the way he described it to me was that he found it immensely interesting that one of the reasons why talking about a variety of different species that exist of humankind, but the only ones that lasted, right? He said there was a variety of human species. He specifically stated that there were 6 of them. But the one that won this race were the ones that developed lying, right? The idea of lying, or the concept of lying, or the whatever we want to call this. Underlying it, we can call it deception. And it really, I was looking at him like, whoa, like I literally just talked about this, or at least that was the overall concept that I couldn't put my finger on. Like, it was so crazy how he just brought up this conversation to me, and it was just like, dude, you gave me the final piece to my puzzle, because this chain that I'm talking about, between these two at least, between the deception and the variety of human species, this is why I called, what did I call this stream? Called it something. Oh, psychological survival of the fittest, right? Now, there is this concept of survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest, right? But in this aspect, we're talking about the psycho aspect of this, which is the psychological aspect of this. Because there are certain behaviors, or at least there are certain, how do I call this? There's a method to the madness, in the sense of the way that we communicate to one another and the way we speak to one another. There is a method to that madness. And if you master that method, you could really guide people in directions, or you can guide or aid their human experience for you, and you're the mediator, right? You're like, what comes to mind is the magician card, but you're essentially crafting the reality of somebody in order to get their psychological state of mind in a certain place, in order for them to have a certain perception of what reality they're experiencing. It sounds very jargonful, but what I'm trying to say is that hype men, right? The same way that there are people that are employed by certain concerts or are employed by certain venues, events. These people are entirely there to create the ambiance of excitement. They're there to aid in the, what do you want to call it? In the perception that they're having fun, or in the perception of they're having a certain kind of experience, right? We call them hype men. Or I call them hype men, because a hype man doesn't even have to be somebody who's like a professional or somebody who's hired. Like, people can have hype men even within their own small friend groups, and essentially, they just aid the experience to be a certain way. So I can't remember his name. Another person that I met at the gym. He was an actor for like some television show. And he gave me a very interesting anecdote where he was talking about how when people go drinking with him, he'll make sure that they don't fuck up his vibe, right? Like, it's kind of a fucked up way of saying it, but he's aware enough that, like, if he sees somebody having a certain kind of like loop pattern and like being sad or X, Y, or Z, he will interject a different kind of attitude in that scenario or in that situation in order to take that person away from what they're thinking about and kind of giving them a better experience, right? Kind of hyping up the situation in order to drive or perpetuate a different state of reality for said person. So, essentially what I'm getting between these two is there are, I don't know how to call this, psychological makeup. I don't want to call them personalities, but nor do I want to call them attitudes, but they're like forms of speech. They're like tactics. They're like psychological makeup techniques or tactics, right? Now, a great example of this is Charlie's Angels, right? I know it's a movie, but to some degree, there has been a long history of certain governments and certain agencies using women to infatuate. I don't want to say this. There's been a use of women so that they'll make them into spies. Actually, damn, I can't remember. She was like the most famous female spy, and she was working on the behalf of the French government, I think. And her whole purpose was to kind of entice all these powerful men into giving her secrets, and she eventually became like a double agent. I really wish I could remember her name, but she was a rather famous spy. But in hijacking conversation and thoughts, and with psychological makeup techniques and tactics, you do get this industry of spying. And not just spying, but like espionage is kind of what I'm talking about. Ooh. Espionage. Kind of one of my favorite videos that I always like bringing up. It was by the New Yorker. Right, I was also looking it up. Espionage. This panel. A panel on espionage. And it's not just a panel on espionage. More specifically, in this whole panel, they do have spies, but they're talking about that there's a new paradigm. Right, this was in 2013. Right, this was at the end of Occupy Wall Street, at the end of seeing government retaliation against hackers. And they actually have one of the younger individuals, this guy. He was somebody very involved in that movement. How do I say this? He kind of brings up the fact that the new level of espionage and the new level of tactics that were born during this era required somebody to have this sort of mindset that is kind of natural to being an espionage person, a spy, a soldier in that mental capacity. But in being that, um, in this panel, he actually brings it up that you need, what do I say? You need multiple personalities. All right, and I know this is going to go into like, isn't that a disorder? Yes and no, because this goes down to the quote of the Japanese quote that I use, that we have three faces. We have three masks that we portray to the world. Those for friends, those for our closest relatives, and another face that we never show anybody. In a weird way, a lot of not a lot of people, but a good portion of people figure out that multiple personalities just means acting. It's kind of a weird way for me to say this, but it's kind of what it is, acting. You need to know how to act in front of certain individuals if you're trying to sell a certain facade, or you're trying to portray a certain different type of you're trying to portray yourself as whatever the other individual. Very difficult for me to explain this, but it's required in espionage, right? Because depending on who you're meeting, depending on who you're trying to impress, depending on what your objective is, depending on what the mission is, you have a different value set towards these things. So it's kind of it plays into needing to know how to act on the fly, needing to know how to appeal to somebody, or needing to know how to not adhere. What's the word that I'm looking for? Playing into what other people want to see of you. This is kind of why women were primarily used in spying and espionage missions back in, at least with this one female spy that I brought up, it was during like World War II. And a lot of it was, you know what a brothel is, right? What do men do at a brothel? Why do men go to brothels? Why do men value that aspect of life so much? In a weird way, this is where it gets into the hijacking component, because your senses are one of the biggest things that are hijacked, because the human experience is so limited that anything that could manipulate any of your senses typically is, we go into drugs, X, Y, or Z, but like one of the oldest professions that we could talk about is brothels, or houses, however we want to call them. Either way. But again, hijacking senses. This just goes into the brothel. I don't know how to spell. Brothel. Men. Spilling the tea. Because usually what they've just, at least what was initially discovered with a lot of soldiers, like once there was a lot more reports and a lot more documentation of what soldiers were doing overseas, it kind of became very apparent to the top brass that it's like, we have a bunch of idiots who keep telling secrets to the females that they're sleeping with, when these people should know not to say any of this to the females that they're sleeping with. So it kind of goes hand in hand with like, well, look at blackmail rings. One of the earliest blackmail rings that I always love to talk about, which is, what was it? Nazi blackmail rings in America. It's already there because like I love talking about this book. Right? The Nazi spy ring in America. You literally had operatives. This is during World War II, right? Hitler's agents, the FBI, and the case stirred the nation. But essentially, you had Nazis coming to America, inviting all of these powerful, influential people to brothels, and then they would take pictures of said people interacting with the employees at the brothel, right? What do you think happened? Especially at a time where it was kind of a big no-no to have lovers in such a capacity, especially when you're married, you're an affluent politician. It put them in compromising situations, right? So this was kind of one of the first, how do I say this? It was one of the first times that you saw blackmail get to the degree that it got to, but for usages of personal favors within government. Because a lot of the people that were involved in this spy ring, or at least in the blackmail ring, were kind of the catalyst to how we got a Nazi scientist into America. And you would have to look at the guy who kind of created the organization, the CIA, right? He had promised, or at least he was a defect agent from Germany, from their like personal secret service KGB kind of like level sort of thing. And when he came over to America, he handed them nothing. And the Americans were like, well, you don't got to worry about that. Like, we know we made a deal between each other, but you don't got to worry about that. A lot of that was because what was he going to hand over? All of the blackmail material that he already had on all of the American politicians? There's levels to how these sort of deals were facilitated. But either way. So espionage, the long use of brothels, and can't forget blackmail. Just gotta end that idea there. So spying, espionage, having multiple personalities in the essence of knowing how to act, knowing how to portray oneself towards a variety of different targets, to especially like one of the biggest things in this is intel. You are essentially required. Intel helps. Intel helps. The more you know about the target, the more you know about their interest, what they're into, etc., will facilitate kind of attacking certain targets. But right, this all started from deception and lying, and the psychological survival of the fittest. Right? These were things that had to occur. Actually, who knows when lying started? Right? I'd imagine it happened when you had a variety of different parties trying to influence a king, or a variety of different merchants or different groups of families that were trying to influence a baron, a king, or right, the moment that groups of people come together in order to facilitate, not facilitate, but groups of people come together, work together in order to try to influence another party or another person. That, to some degree, is deception. And that's happened in history a lot of times. A lot of times. Now, so this comes into, how do I say this? Because I don't want to use the word superior, but superior markets, right? Joking, but superior in the sense that this is the tactic that just won. It was the king in getting how do I say this? What I'm trying to describe is there are certain psychological amalgamations of how we act with one another. Everyone's different, but to some degree, some people are even better at mimicking the behaviors of other people, right? They can splice apart somebody else's behavior patterns, learn them, and use them at any whim. It's a very weird kind of, because it all relates to, at least from what my perspective of this, the tactic of mimicry. I think that's what you call it. Mimicry is, I'm pretty dumb, so I'm gonna have to look this up. Mimicry, right? The action or art of imitating someone or something. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There you go. So the tactic is called mimicry, but I'm essentially using the mimicry tactic as Hollywood actors using it to win awards, using it, right? That is one of the ways that I could describe this easily because, to some degree, movies, or at least the art of film, is kind of a game of perception. And it primarily hinges on the fact of how well can you sell what you're feeling, right? Like there's a variety of other elements that go into this: framing, perspective, the lens, the music that's being used, and the color grading of the scene, and the color of the backdrop, the backgrounds, the building that you're in. Right there's more to it, but at the core principle of this, before it was Hollywood actors, it was theater. And in theater, I was a theater kid because I was a fucking nerd. You have to learn how to do it with nothing. How do I say this? No backdrops, no props, no. It's like your stage presence is what sells everything. The way you inflict your voice, the way that you look at your hands if you're pretending to hold something. Like, I just remember the amount of times that I caught people just practicing being in a kitchen, even though there was no kitchen. Eventually, at the end product, there was going to be like a cutout of something that looked like a kitchen, and eventually the people could act out. But in order, before they got that part, they had to act it out in a way where they had no props. And a lot of that goes into, right, we're mimicking behaviors that exist in real life, right? If you're cooking. But in this example, it's for theater and Hollywood actors, on how the use of mimicry and the use of you learning how to act out other people's behaviors can help you in the scenario. But mimicry is also used in espionage. So we can make a light connection to this. Because in espionage, right, it's like, what's that one science in criminology where it's like you're trying to read people's body language, depending on where they look when they're pulling up information from their own head, depending on how they act, if they have like if they scratch nervously, if they bite their nails, right? They're like, there's blanket examples of behaviors. So by superior, we're just talking about psychological behaviors that survived. I don't know how to describe this. So when I say superior, I'm just basically talking about how there are certain behaviors that we kind of ooze out, and that other people see other people ooze out these behaviors, and it becomes a monkey see monkey do thing, where if you see somebody act a certain way and it works for them, eventually another person will come by and be like, I like the way this person does X, Y, or Z. I'm going to mimic that behavior because, so there is this level of survival of the fittest, only in the sense that if it works, and it'll continue down the line. Some people could use this as an example from when parents are raising a child, or when a child is around certain family members and they're just learning the behaviors of said older family members. Drinking this protein shake is so hard. But, right, so there are just certain behaviors that they're not superior in any sense. They're just superior in the sense that these are behaviors that have just been passed down because they've just survived. So it's not that there are superior traits in how to behave. It's just that they survive and they get passed down the line. Oh, and it gets worse when you, I don't know if I want to get into that, but so the tactic here is mimicry. You can copy other people's behaviors. Now, a personal anecdote that I really don't like talking about was I was really good at this at one point, where so when I was much bigger and much fatter, I recognized that there was this level of people would let me get away with certain things because they didn't see me as a threat. They didn't see me as a problem to whatever situation was occurring around me. So I found it very easy to move in life behaving the way people wanted to see me. It's very fucked up. Like when I really think about it, this is not okay. Because I would allow people to create the narrative of what they thought of me. And I knew that if I played into what these people perceived me as, I can just exist within that parameters. And as long as I keep doing that, it won't matter because I'll eventually move. I used to move a lot when I was younger. So it was a really easy way of me existing where when I went to New York, I didn't really interact with anybody. So I don't know. I guess we could say like when I was in Texas, right? I started adopting other behavior patterns that other kids had because, I wanted to be accepted. I wanted to have friends. So when did this started happening? I want to say, either way, it was just a learned behavior that I learned that people wanted to label me and put me in a box. And once they did that, I knew that as long as I acted in accordance to what was in this box, nobody would be surprised. Nobody would assume anything of me, right? Right? I was safe, not from criticism, but from them being aware of who I really was. Like there's this whole weird thing that comes with that. So it's kind of fucking weird. But there are very few circumstances that people are put into where they learn that. And if they learn that, it kind of displays a certain kind of like intelligence and trait inside of people's personalities that kind of lean them towards theater, lean them towards acting, or lean them towards certain fields in certain industries. Because if you have a business smile and you know how to put your foot in the door, you can practically sell anything. And that goes into, right, it's not just psychological makeup that does this, but to some degree, I don't know, can I say that? Right? Because it goes with your speech, your inflection, the words that you use. Because then there's also this science called NLP. No. Neural Linguistic Programming. Neurolinguistic programming is a pseudoscientific approach to communication, personal development, and psychotherapy. The first appeared in Richard Bandler and John Grandier's 1975 book, The Structure. Used to assess and treat a variety of clinical symptoms, including depression, anxiety, and stress. Well, either way, neurolinguistic programming. It is. Some people don't want to call it an evil science, but I would put money on the fact that this is an evil fucking science. Because, it depends on whose hands, right? Depending on who's using it, depending on what their motives are, etc., etc. Like, it's not inherently evil. It's just understanding that side of human comprehension is kind of like, you're walking a fine line, buddy. Either way, right? Because when you combine all of these different aspects, you can make a really great spy. You can do some great espionage. And all of this also feeds into con men and con women. Because using their special powers of understanding social cues. Oh yeah, social cues. Fuck. I could have just said all that, right? Or just put social cues. Yo no sé how to spell, so I don't know how to spell that. Either way, con men, con women. Essentially, they hinge on a very simple fact of social cues. This also goes back into intel helps. Knowing your target, knowing who they are. Do they have family? Do you have a meaningful way of bringing up certain conversations? Right? This kind of also requires social skills, right? Because you can't just know that your target has a son, because then your target's going to be like, well, how did you know I had a son, right? Either way, it goes into like, there's a practicality to bringing up certain conversation points. I'm terrible at that. Like, if I just want to skip the bullshit, like, let's go into a long, deep conversation, because I suck at small talk. Like, it's kind of atrocious. So I can't do any of this because small talk is kind of required in all this, right? Social skills. You'd be surprised how much small talk really helps in these sort of circumstances. But they use social skills, they use perception building. You know, the apparel that they wear, the car, job or slash, how do I say this? Titles? Titles? My brain. Job, titles, or perceived social status. This matters. This really matters, because sometimes somebody could be broke, busted, and disgusted. Like, you wouldn't like, but what you're looking at, you would assume like, oh, this individual has everything in his life in order. He could talk really well. They could portray themselves to be something, but behind all that, it's just because you perceive the social status doesn't necessarily mean that it translates. So this goes into this business of con menning, or just being a con. Social cues, social skills, perception building. What's something else that we could talk about with con men? Just con artists in general. Actually, that's what I should just write. Con artist. Business model, you know? I guess another thing we can use for this is parties. Ugh. Parties, events, people of status, or using people of status. An example for that would be like, right, if somebody's running a con and they're trying to portray themselves to be a spiritual leader, but they have pictures with the Dalai Lama, it kind of really sells the idea that, oh, he must be a spiritual leader because he has pictures with the Dalai Lama. That's an example of Nixium. They recently got charged. I've also talked about them before. In a weird way, acting. You can know all these things, but if you can't act it, it doesn't really sell well. It could go into social skills, but not really. And the reason why I say that is because there is something about acting that kind of requires the body. It requires a level of looking sincere. It requires a level of animation, right? Like that has to come from like your body and the way that you move your body in a weird way. But we could just put body language. Uh, social engineering? No, that would fit over here. Hmm. I want to say naive, like a naive gauge, where like a good con artist has like this internal barometer or an internal gauge that allows the individual to be able to gauge their target in the sense of like, can I fool this person or can I not fool this person? There is like that internal, like Dragon Ball Z, the scatter. This retard's level is at like, not to be disparaging, but I mean, either way, con artists, social cues, social skills, acting, body language. Oh no, acting with body language, and then naive gauge. And the naive gauge is rather large, like rather large, because all you really need to do sometimes is put an MD degree in front of it, and then it's just like, oh, he must be a doctor. He must know what he's talking about. Or, what do you call those things? Certificates, right? Like you walk into somebody's office and there's like a wall of certificates on the wall, and you're just like, oh, this dude looks like he's fucking qualified to put something up my butt, right? Like certified for okay. So like you could be naive. It doesn't mean you have to be brain dead. It just means that if they present the idea to you in such a capacity that, and if right, all in accordance with acting, body language, their perception building skills, their social skills, and if you're in front of them and they're paying attention to your social cues and the way that you're presenting the idea, or at least they're presenting the idea, you're reacting, them paying attention to your reactions. Just put targets reactions. As long as they can gauge these things, it kind of sells what they're trying to do. So con artists use a variety of different skill sets in order to hijack your conversation, your thoughts, in order for you to give them money. A lot of the times that's always the game. Anytime that they don't ask you for money, well, that con artist is out for your mind. And not only are they out for your mind, that gives them influence, but in a I don't know how to say this. I want to say political front, but spiritual leaders are a very interesting bunch, especially with I can't remember this Christian organization that got caught in Brazil, and it turned out that the guy had like a human baby farm where he was just impregnating his followers, and then he was selling the kids on the black market. Can't remember the guy's name, but he got arrested in Brazil. Hand of God, or can't remember. He was considering himself like some spiritual guru, but even though they're not asking anything from you up front, you're still giving them your mind. And in some cases, this is where it gets into that whole scary woo-woo of mind, body, and soul, which was something that I had a conversation with my buddy Richie. That's what the number 666 means, because 666 is all about like balance and all this other numerological stuff that I don't want to get into right now. So, right, these are just tactics that have survived the test of time. So, in these, it's kind of weird to call them psychological tactics, but psycho tactics. It is weird to call them psychological tactics because that's the way I'm perceiving them. The way I'm bringing up this information is through the way that I'm looking at behaviors that are exhibited by individuals in our reality, right? It's an observation that I'm making that there is a level of behaving in the world that will get you certain results, right? So this is just behaviors. Behaviors that, right, this goes back into like you can mimic these behaviors. Where was I going with this idea? There's a sell factor, right? Because at the end of the day, you have it all right. Your body language is on point. Your language is on point. You could sell this idea. Behaviors, sell factor. And it's just going to put what works, right? Which is kind of why I fucking laugh at the modern dating scene. Because a lot of the modern dating stuff, if you kind of look at any of these red pill guys, or it's not to say it works for all guys, but they've essentially just boiled it down to this. If you look right, and that just by that it means if you're the right guy who looks a certain kind of way and you put yourself out there in a variety of different situations, you'll always run into a chick that will classify you as the right guy at the right time. And if you say the right things and if you act the right way, right, if you build up this perception of yourself in these capacities, you can essentially get the girl. But there's more levels to it than that. But the dating scene has become such an instant gratifying machine, right? You fucking pull the lever, ding, 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 right? You just roll the dice. And because of how quick it is, people are stuck in that 30-second to 1 minute interview sort of like stage of judging people, I guess. I don't know how to say this. So, where am I going with this? The way the modern dating scene is working, it's kind of put itself in a situation where that's what it is right now. Where if you exhibit these psychological traits, if you have the behavior, if you have the sell, and if you have what works for that moment, for that girl or for that guy, X, Y, or Z, you can move things and progress them very quickly, right? You're hijacking their expectations. You're then hijacking the conversations and their thoughts in order to push forward what either party wants, which is usually sex nowadays. But just an example of how psychotactics or psychological tactics are working right now. When you involve other ideas like OnlyFans, because that whole industry reminds me of a brothel. Like, it really does, right? Like, you're going to be one of the best girls if you know how to talk, if you know how to show your goods, if you know how to act a certain way, if you know how to X, Y, or Z certain traits of yourself, right? Like, in a weird way, it puts, I want to say, a mental strain on these chicks because they're put in a scenario where they're constantly in this kind of paradigm where they're building up the perception of who they are. They're constantly practicing their social skills, and they're constantly exercising that part of the brain that is required in understanding social cues. And again, the naive gauge and them acting for certain things. That's just an example, right? Then you get Twitch, right? You get into streamers because in a weird way you can say that there is like this sort of formula that you can understand when it comes down to what makes a successful personality. Keep that in mind, a successful personality. Because what you'll typically find is What was that one chick's name? She's like some fucking like Latina who puts on makeup to make herself look hella crazy, but like even she understands that the reason people watch her YouTube channel isn't because of who she personally is, it's because of the character that she portrayed. Another great example is Joji. He's a music artist now, but back in the day he was Filthy Frank, and Filthy Frank was absolutely filthy. Like like I I grew up watching his content, and I I've I don't know. He was very influential in my life, is what I could say. But this goes into personalities, right? Like not just Twitch streaming, but how do I say this? Not televised personalities, because now you have YouTube personalities. But I'm just gonna put personalities, because you could portray one kind of personality, but the real like has nothing to do with that. I always remembered, okay, this is a personal anecdote, but I always remembered when I made friends on the internet and then they later met me in real life, they always told me the same thing. You are nothing like what I'd imagine you to be in real life. Because on the internet, I'm loud, I'm obnoxious. I say there's a different level of me that you would get if you met me through a forum, a Discord call, um, TeamSpeak, Mumble. Like these are just different VoIPs, voice over internet protocols. Chat rooms is what I'm trying to say. If you met me through any of these avenues, I portray myself to be a very different kind of individual. It's not like it's not me, it's just that I don't have that reserve of the personal dynamic. Cuz you meet me in person, I'm much more reserved. I'm much quieter. I'm not as loud. I know I'm not as obnoxious because I'm taking into consideration uh the social ambience, the environment. I just take into consideration that I can't just behave that way in front of normal people because again, they're normal people. Like, you know what I mean? Like the internet's a very different place. So there are different levels of these of psycho tactics that exist. And using OnlyFans, Twitch streamers, and we could use YouTube personalities. We can also say television, because sometimes people were put in vicarious situations where they had to act out, right, in television shows or on a script or on a movie. But that doesn't necessarily apply, because once an actor was labeled as a certain kind of actor, well, that actor only ever had that typecast to exist in. And it gets into a whole other bag of woo. So that's just like conversation stuff. Thoughts. Now, in hijacking thoughts, that whole system, it revolves around school. It revolves around what people consider authentic. Authentic. It has the seal of approval. Seal of approval. Now, the seal of approval, I don't know, right? Like, find any piece of information and look for the seal of approval. Was it sponsored by the CDC? Was it sponsored by the government? Was it sponsored by Congress, the House of Representatives, a certain kind of library that has some sort of reputation, a teachers association, a medical association, the Association of Engineers of X, Y, or Z, or the Metal Workers Association of blah 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 blah, right? Like there's a seal of approval that we've developed in school because we assume that, well, there was a group of geniuses that were sitting down together and that's how this piece of information made it to me, without recognizing right? That's what we like to think how things work. In reality, there's a system there of how things are approved of. But either way, and in thoughts, yeah, I forgot. There's also the social level of this, social acceptance. Um, because at the end of the day, to some degree, there's I'm not going to say there's a huge population of people who don't have schooling, but there is a huge portion of population of people that believe that school wasn't for them. So their thoughts are guided and formulated in a very different way. And a lot of it comes from their social acceptance. And by what I mean by that is their environment, right? Like, what were the kind of people that were around them that would talk? How were they like? And how much of that influence is kind of rubbed off on the other individuals? Um, a great example of this, at least anecdotally, would be when I have conversations with older, I can't say older because I also fit in that demographic. Like, there are people from the ages of 30 to 40 who are from the hood, South Central, or bad neighborhoods of Echo Park, or just rough neighborhoods. And because of the way that they were spit out of the school system, it left a bad taste in their mouth in such a degree where they believe that education wasn't for them. And they'll have this preconceived notion that they're stupid, or that they're retarded, or that their brain wasn't meant for thinking, without recognizing that the schooling system isn't the end all be all in dictating intelligence. And that kind of escapes them. And I've always seen, like, I don't know, I always like using my brother-in-law as an example because he has a really great mind. Like, if he sits down and thinks about it, he can build anything. Like, he likes working with wood, he likes working with metal, soldering, and all sorts of things. Like, when he's in the right mood, he'll apply himself in a variety of different things and he'll figure it out. But once you mention the topic of the seal of approval, right? Because he doesn't have the seal of approval that school gives, he always puts himself down. And all of that creativity will die down with it. And I always kind of get really angry at that because it's like, we put so much hope and emphasis and importance in the school system that we've kind of forgot, where did the seal of approval come from? What was the thing that approved that, right? Like, just because it has the seal of approval doesn't necessarily mean that it works, right? Like, not everybody's the same mold, not everybody thinks the same. Not everybody has the same learning pattern. And then that also, there's levels to this. There's always levels and nuances to all this because it all depends on, like, what were your parents like? What kind of language did they use with you? Was it affirming language or was it demeaning language? Because that'll also give you a barometer test of the individual of, were they willing to try new things? Were they willing to give it their all? I recognized, I can't even remember when I watched this, but it was recent. And it was a video of basically a lady that just brought up the topic of, like, about procrastination. And that one of the stages that builds procrastination in an individual is, how often was your parent criticizing you for, it wasn't that you did it wrong or right, it was just a parent that was constantly overbearing with, did you do it? Or can you do it? Right? Like, that whole kind of, like, for me, it was eating. My dad would try to get me to eat all sorts of weird things. And he's just like, you're a Ramirez. We own restaurants. You need to learn X, Y, and Z. And, like, it put me off that I became not just a picky eater, but I didn't realize his overbearing sense of, I don't know how to say it. Like, just because I would be criticized so often, it led me to developing a fear of doing anything. Like, it was really weird. But nuances to all this stuff. So, your thoughts are essentially kind of guided by school and the seal of approval. And the seal of approval can also come in the form of media, officials. Doesn't necessarily have to be government officials. It could also be officials of a science institute, NASA, SpaceX, just people that you would assume come from an official capacity. Like, at the end of the day, it could be a guy in a suit. You don't even know what the background is of the guy in the suit. He's just the guy in a suit saying some really intelligent shit that you're just like, oh, I should believe him. Comes in a variety of formats. Media, officials, also come from government. Could also come from international institutes. Researchers say that if you put this up your butt, you become 10 times smarter, right? Like that whole scientific. I'm just going to put scientific as the word, because at the end of the day, like, scientists agree that 9 out of 10 scientists, or, you know what I mean? Like, just the use of the word science is enough for people to be like, maybe I should put that up my butt. But either way. No, I do not condone any activities that involve butt. Find a wife. Find a wife. Have a family. Fight the eugenics movement off. What else could I go with? People hijacking thoughts. Could get into that. Actually, I do have this video that I wanted to play.
We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens, because in the coming generations, we will learn how to engineer bodies and brains and minds. Now, how exactly will the future masters of the planet look like? This will be decided by the people who own the data. Now, why is data so important? It's important because we have reached the point when we can hack not just computers, we can hack human beings and other organisms. Now, what do you need in order to hack a human being? You need two things. You need a lot of computing power, and you need a lot of data, especially biometric data. But control of data might enable human elites to do something even more radical than just build digital dictatorships. By hacking organisms, elites may gain the power to re-engineer the future of life itself. Because once you can hack something, you can usually also engineer it. All of life, for 4 billion years, dinosaurs, amoebas, tomatoes, humans, all of life was subject to the laws of natural selection and to the laws of organic biochemistry. But this is now about to change. Science is replacing evolution by natural selection with evolution by intelligent design. Not the intelligent design of some god above the clouds, but our intelligent design and the intelligent design of our clouds. The IBM cloud, the Microsoft cloud, these are the new driving forces of evolution. And at the same time, science may enable life, after being confined for 4 billion years to the limited realm of organic compounds, science may enable life to break out into the inorganic realm. We are probably one of...
So, I guess I could go back to this book, Sapiens. Yuval Noah Harari, which is actually this guy that I just showed you.
We are probably...
We've reached a point where we can not just hack... we can hack not just computers, we can hack human beings and other organisms. You know, this also comes down with GMOs. How did I want to tie this in? Officials, government, international institutions, the use of the word scientific. I had an idea that was going to draw this all together, but I'm about to be an hour in, which is all right. But Yuval is also a very interesting individual because of what are the like what would the elites look like who are driving this forward? And to me, it always comes down to this thing called school is funded and managed in large part by oversight committees. Right? These oversight committees have audits. They're like, oh, this material would be good to learn here. This good material would be good to learn here, without recognizing that these oversight committees are put together. And when you look at the overarching thing that brings them all together, it's, I don't want to say investors, but I just want to say money. Because I brought it up with schools, book publishers, textbooks, and just the university industry as a whole, and how it's a revolving door for private contractors, private contracts, private investments, and DOD. No, how do I say this? Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that, in large part, there are very prestigious universities in America that largely get to handle some of the most interesting aspects of science. You can imagine when the computer was first coming out and rolling out with the internet and the interconnectivity of such a thing, universities were the first to interact with these systems. So, with money comes audits, approval, right? And that approval either comes by corporation, grants, or a government program or government sanctioned program, because insurance, either way. And I want to say agenda, but by agenda, I'm not saying that somebody's planning out meticulously this entire plan of how to rule the world. It's just like, no, they have hundreds of other scientists working at the same time. They have thousands of other projects that they have to oversee. For them, it doesn't matter if you succeed or fail. For them, it's what were the results? What was the intelligence report from this experiment? And where can we move forward from here? So, how do I bring this together? Audits, approval, and agenda. The triple A's. Somebody has to be the mediator. Kind of what I'm trying to get to. These three things all have a mediator. The mediator, or the talent hunter, let's call it that. Talent hunter, right? There's somebody that can recognize the talent. They can recognize the star, right? They can recognize that this individual has a mindset that can view the world the way we want them to view the world. One of the most famous products of talent hunting would be our boy Fauci Dino. Considering the length of time he served in government, considering all of the things that he personally approves of certain grants that are given to the medical field. So you can imagine how much power and influence he has over university professors, students, people looking to approve certain projects, so on and so on. But enough about this guy. This goes back more into the mediator, talent hunter sort of thing. Which, actually, I could tie back into Yuval. Yuval is just one of these idea guys. There was even a lot of controversy on his book. Did that save in my history? Yeah. Is Sapiens an unoriginal book? The guy basically says that it's not that he plagiarized. It's not that he stole other people's ideas. He was just the idea guy. He just basically saw a bunch of scientific research articles and started noticing a trend in anthropology. What he then did was used all of these segmented ideas, brought them together to explain in that book a brief, what was it called? A Brief History of Humankind. He just brought the ideas together and formulated it down to a book. Like, the way I see it, there's no real plagiarism in that because, there are really intelligent people that can have a one-track mind, but that doesn't necessarily mean it'll get them far. Just because sometimes people develop tunnel vision when they become specialized or specialist. So it's not that you need to be a jack of all trades. Like, everything has its place. Yuval's was just somebody who can see the overarching picture of human anthropology and kind of distilling it in brief, how do I say this? In explaining what he wanted to explain, right? Because he goes from the agricultural age to the industrial age. He really exemplifies what stages humanity needed to hit, and he really describes them well. I haven't read the book. I'm just going based off from what I heard from Richie, from what I've seen in a few videos that I watched, etc., etc. So I don't have a problem with that, because that's the way I see myself. But with Yuval, him speaking at the World Economic Forum, and he's probably a world economic leader, that's just like a list that they have online. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. Just, hey, like, look, he has the status of this. But it's more of the fact that he's been recognized as a really good idea guy. That's the way I view it, and that's the way I'm going to view it. So, who hunted him? Who is the person that constantly looks for talent to pick out these individuals, these scientists, people who are going to head new departments? Like, when AI came about back in like 2001, AI, algorithms, and this whole concept, eventually a few of these people had to win government contracts to push forward through this. And if it wasn't government contracts, we could just look at Intel, IBM, or anybody that sponsored a cloud. You can look at their employee records and be like, oh, this was the guy that was hired. This is the guy who's heading the department. This is the individual who's heading this specific program or that specific program. At some point, it becomes classified information. Only certain people are allowed to know certain things. Because, historically, you've always seen that government will seek out private contractors in order to push forward to certain ideas or certain experiments or certain projects, etc., etc. Like when they first discovered plutonium, like the government had to write up something in order for it to go to approval. And then that person to be like, well, who can we offer this contract to? Well, let's offer it to the best universities who have the best minds for researching what plutonium is. How it got to the hands of certain university professors that started feeding pregnant women plutonium, I don't know how far that goes. Oh, and by the way, they knew from the very beginning plutonium was going to have a disastrous effect on their health. Like, they knew it was going to kill people. Can't remember the name of the experiment, but they had tested it on military soldiers, and that's how they figured it out. But they wanted to push it even further. They wanted to see what would happen to pregnant women. What happens if we irradiate people's body parts? What happens if we inject them with this much amount of the substance? And so on and so on and so on, right? Back to the beginning of the chain is somebody has to give their signature in order for approval of a lot of this stuff. I don't know how I fit this in. I don't even think I fit this in very well. But solution by intelligent design, not the intelligent side of some god. IBM cloud, no.
We are probably of our clouds. And at the same time, science makes dinosaurs, amoebas, tomatoes, humans, all of life.
I can't remember what else. There's something else I feel like I'm missing about bringing up about Yuval. But he was essentially the guy that wrote the book Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, which kind of also brings up this whole thing of, where did I write it down? Deception. People hijacking variety of human specimens, deception, lying, and how it fits into the survival of the fittest, right? That's one of the reasons why I think Yuval was picked, was because of this factor, understanding deception and lying. Because empire. Seems like I'm going left field there, but an empire requires divisions of people. Divisions of people. Not everybody can be king. Not everybody can be a vassal. Not everybody can be a baron. Not everybody could be a marquis. Not everybody. There needed to be a classification amongst people in order for people to do their jobs, right? The roads don't get maintained if they have no road runner or road workers. To some capacity, the street lights that we depend on for stopping and going, if there weren't people maintaining that infrastructure, what would modern life look like? Is kind of what I'm getting to. So, in these divisions of people, I'd assume we have decision makers. I just remembered this quote. Why cast pearls to swine? So decision makers have their own culture, their own view of life. Kind of where I got this quote from. Because some guy that I was watching brought it up, because it was a beautiful analogy that I used, so I can't say it verbatim. But he essentially described that there are people who have been making the decisions for a very long time. Their grandfather was doing it. Their grandfather's grandfather was doing it. And if it wasn't them, it was somebody within the family. There was always a culture of getting to make decisions, getting to make these big moves of government, I guess. I don't know what you want to call them. And people who typically take the role of leadership find themselves in such position because they can recognize what works and what doesn't work. Right? Yes, there's more nuances because they can have factions, they can have allegiances, they can have loyalties that they respect. Yeah, we can get into the nuance of things, but let's just basically understand that there are decision makers. And once you have the level of education, once you have the level of understanding that these decision makers have, it comes down to a point that they themselves have to recognize what's good advice and what's bad advice. Between these two things, they can hear the crowds yelling at them for all that they want. But at the end of the day, they know that if they give them their decision, these are the problems that come with it. If they make this other decision, these are the pros and cons, right? They'll view the pros and cons in an ideal world. Obviously, that's not the system that we run in. We got lobby groups. We got other people who have vested interest in certain aspects of the world working the way it works because profit, I guess, but not where we're going right now. Decision makers, with them being able to distinguish good advice and bad advice, they've developed this belief that why should they cast pearls to swine? Why should they give people who have no, right? They don't have the pedigree. They don't have the legacy. They don't have the background of being able to make decisions. Why should I let them make the decision? Why should we give them these positions of authority, positions of power, or positions of signatures? That's what I call them, because At the end of the day, sometimes certain offices and certain positions only exist to sign off on certain aspects of a corporation, business, office officials, university people, etc., etc. Complicated. I wish I could explain it even better, but I think that's the best I could do for right now. Divisions of people, decision makers. That's just the decision makers. Then we also have like merchants. It's a terrible M. Merchants have their own role. Producers. Manufacturers. We can go on and on, right? Miners. At the very bottom of this, you basically have citizens / workers. Because at the end of the day, to some degree, some of these positions have been monopolized. They don't allow competition to exist for very long, right? Because you typically would get bought out. But either way, amongst all of these classes of people, what's allowed certain family dynasties to keep on existing? What's allowed certain corporations to keep existing? What's allowed certain families to maintain and hold on to their fortunes? I can't say fame, but just their fortunes, right? How did ownership how was it kept within the family is all I'm trying to say. Because you have to understand, at the end of the day, merchants, producers, and manufacturers have people, right? People can be fooled. Manipulated. Or affected. Right? That's all I'm saying. And that we have a world where we have this sort of profession that exists. We have con artists in our reality. So con artists, or people who have an interest in trying to affect the most important people, right? Merchants, decision makers, producers, and manufacturers. Nowadays, it's just a Google search away of who owns this, who manages this, and who does that. So these people can become potential targets. And this is where I thought the aspect of the psychological survival of the fittest came in. Because I'm not saying Yuval was wrong. I'm just adding that there is a different dimension of thought process that comes with deception and lying. Because if you look at the history of the Vatican churches, if you look at the history of the Vatican Church in general, one of my favorite examples is, what was his name? Saint. I don't know if he was a saint, but I think he was a bishop. Yeah, Bishop Lucifer. So, this gets into a whole other bag of worms. People can be lied to. History could be manipulated. What you see sometimes isn't necessarily what you think it is. And there are people of interest who are primary targets. I want to say back in these days, during this time period, 370 AD, I think it was more a question of who got control over what aspect of church, religion, because there was a time period where being religious meant something, where being a part of the faith or having family within certain religious structures that gave you access to political favors. It sounds crazy, but there was a point in time where religion played a huge part in shifting the gears of politics because they had control over the people's minds. And there was a lot of theater, dance, and play when it came down to oh, did you hear this world leader met with this religious figure and this and that? Like, at some point in time, it actually mattered. So you have people like Lucifer of Cagliari. The only reason why we have a Lucifer as a devil is because this guy eventually became a problem for the existing church that existed. So they were just like, basically a pope was like, fuck this dude. He's going against the main political faction within the church. We're going to label him a heretic. We're going to do the X, Y, and Z. Not only that, we're going to make his name the modern name for the devil. It's like, what? But I'm just saying, lying and deception were integral, right? This whole technique, this whole concept, this idea was integral to how modern history played out. I don't think I emphasized that very well, but I'm going to leave that video here.